Hello and welcome to this episode of Network Insights. As you may already be aware, Network Insights is our opportunity to speak to the amazing people who make up our network and to give them the opportunity to share insights into their work in relation to supporting people to be more physically active. This month's episode is focusing on developing programs to get communities moving. And it's without further ado and my great pleasure to hand over to Elaine to introduce today's guest.
I'm absolutely delighted to have Dr. William Bird with us today. And I was looking back through some of your bio and I was like thinking about your career and I was thinking, where do we start? Because going back and I think I first went to a conference where I saw you speak, and it probably wasn't far off 1996, thinking back when you set up Walking for Health, what eventually became Walking for Health. Then you moved on to look at green gyms, I believe. And then I think when I first came into contact with you in terms of us working together, it was when you were essentially setting up what was the forerunner of Clinical Champions in London, in Newark, I think it was, wasn't it? And at that time, I remember you coming to see us with this little credit card going, I've got this idea. I said, I think I can get whole communities to move, and we're going to use this credit card, and they're going to go around and they're going to basically tap the card against sensors so we know how far they've gone. And lo and behold, that became Beat the Streets. So wow, amazing career. So thank you for joining us today. So if you want to think back to that, your early career in terms of setting up Walking for Health, what was it that was driving you as a GP in a practice to start thinking about physical activity?
Thanks. And it was, in general practice, I was the newbie. I was the new doctor, and the new doctor was given the responsibility always, historically, of the diabetes. So I was in charge of the diabetes patients. And then we were much more involved with diabetes. Now it's a diabetes nurse and you hardly ever see the doctor. But then we were still very much involved. But they still had to go and see the nurse. They still had to go and see the dietitian, and they'd have to have chiropody done, and they'd have to have their blood test done. And then it was back to me again. And the bit that I had to finish off was the physical activity, because there was no specialist there to do that. We had the dietitian doing a dietitian, although they always tried to avoid that person because they felt they were going to be told off, which they were, which was quite scary. But anyway, they came back to me and I said, okay, how much activity you've done? They said, well, you know how difficult it is. And I said, well, why? Because they said, well, I'm not sporty. I don't like swimming. I don't like going to the gym. And I thought, okay, well, that's fair enough. What about walking? And they said, well, that's not really enough. And at the time, that was the kind of the general consensus, was you had to do vigorous activity. But luckily, some research was coming out at that time from Melvin and others and saying, actually, walking is just as good. And some of the big studies coming out in the cohort studies coming out in the mid-90s showing that walking was as good as some of the vigorous activity, and we could go for that. So I kind of said, well, let's get these little maps together. And we put these brilliant little maps, and they had pictures of the areas, and they had lots of other things. Sent them out to all the patients and said, right, here we go. We did an evaluation on it, and everyone who walked already walked more, and everyone who didn't walk stayed not walking. That was my first lesson in actually doing a physical activity program. It just enhances the people who walk. So I got everyone together and we thought, right, what is it that's stopping you from walking? In a village hall, we have 50 people who had diabetes, and they all said in unison from the women, it's too dangerous, we don't like going out. And for the men, they felt quite insecure about climbing over stiles, which actually, unfortunately, around here was quite important. They didn't feel that they were able to come back. They get stuck with their hips or something like that. So they were quite frightened. So we said, okay, let's do lead walks. And that's how it started. They all thought it was a good idea. From that meeting, 6 people volunteered to do the very first walks. And I think we got it going within about 6 months in April 1996. And there'd been 10 walks in Sonning Common every single week ever since that one day. So it never, ever stopped. And that's how it carried on. And then, of course, we learned a huge amount about the health by stealth. It's about the social and the nature, and that's how the green gym then came about, because a lot of people didn't want to go on a walk because it was a bit dominated by females, 2/3. So a lot of men wanted to do something a bit more kind of grungy, they felt, and they wanted to do activities outdoors, and that's how the green gym came about a couple of years later.
Wow,
that's brilliant. I love the way that there's already quite clear, and I can sense, knowing where you are now in relation to intelligent health and the Beat the Street program, there's an obvious kind of golden thread running through where one leads to the next and to the next in that sense. You mentioned in 1996 you were the newbie and coming up with these new ideas. I'm just curious, William, what was the motivation behind it for you? Was it a case of you were seeing the same patients and the same issues were coming about and you thought something can be done different? Was it evidence led? Was it just a personal passion? Is there anything there?
It was a bit of everything, actually, Craig. It was the evidence, definitely. And I wasn't an academic in any sense of a word. I didn't really kind of understand that. But I remember trying to put the bid in for the British Heart Foundation. I had to do the evidence. And so as a young GP, you're not looking at papers all the time. Certainly not then. You probably do a lot more now. But to get that proposal together, and in fact the very first one was to the Countryside Agency, or Countryside Commission as it was then, to get some money to get it going, and they wanted some evidence. So that really kind of thought, well, why aren't we promoting walking? Why are we still talking about gyms and swimming and those kind of things? Why are we not talking about walking? And there was a massive gap, and I remember the CMO, I think even before that time, said that walking was a waste of time, didn't have any health benefits. It had to be vigorous activity. So, there was a massive, it was a real difficult message to get across. So that was one thing that came out. So I thought, well, here's the evidence, we should do it. I suppose my father was a GP, my mum was a naturalist. So being outdoors and getting people connected was always back of my mind, because I knew how important it was. I didn't know new research at the time, but I just knew it was something important to get people outdoors. And I think generally I just felt there was something about all of that coming together, that we could do something which the patients could lead. You didn't need an expert. And at the time, exercise referral was really big. Everything was all about exercise on referral, going to gyms and leisure centres. And you had to have, a level 1, 2, 3, 4, all these different levels to do these things. And I thought, well, walking shouldn't need any of these levels. You should be able to do it yourself. But again, that was quite difficult, because they said, oh, what happens if a patient falls over? What happens if they have hypo? And it was all that kind of worries about all these things that could happen, and justifying why we needed all these trained people rather than patients doing it. So I think that was a kick against the system, which I was quite enjoying to do that. So I think that was my slight kind of, I've always perhaps been on the edge of systems, never quite totally involved with them. But if you keep on the edge, you keep one foot in the kind of traditions, and you keep one foot out to explore new ways of doing things. And you always try and ride two horses as you go along.
Yeah, it's very interesting how kind of, obviously you listen out for the things that you want to, but earlier today we were speaking with Versus Arthritis around evaluating a program that we're working with them on, and the intention to action gap is a common thing that we see, people having the all due intentions to take action and, let's say, become more active, but then them doing that, there's another big leap to be made. And as an agent for change, almost the role of the GP or the allied health professional, I think research from Activity Alliance suggested that if advice on becoming more active comes from a trusted source like a GP or otherwise, people are up to 2/3 more likely to take action as a result of that being kind of a trusted source giving them that advice. So I'm wondering whether that's part of the success that you've seen in the work that you've been able to do, the fact that there is that connection between physical activity and health, if we call it that, as we see in the sector. Is there anything there that you think is interesting to share?
Yeah, I mean, when we called it health walks, it made sense then, because the health was the new bit. This was something completely new about health, and then the GP leading it. So because I was a GP, it opened lots of doors for funding, but also for patients to want to do something for the practice, because they were doing it for their community, but they were doing it for the practice as well. Not so much for me, but for the practice. And that was a kind of feeling of doing it. So there was that connection of that trusted source. You're absolutely right. But what we also know is that, and what came out very strongly, and I remember one of the conferences with the BHF, which were always so brilliant. It was a health by stealth, and I can't remember when it was.
Yes,
it was quite a long. It was always advanced, and I think that I was so pleased, because what I was very much realizing is that although people do want to become healthy, so that gets them going, but what keeps them there is the enjoyment, and we forget that. We sometimes think they're doing it because they want to carry on being healthy. Well, that fades very quickly when you're bored. So we all know, if you're doing exercises for an old shoulder injury or something like that, we all start every morning doing these exercises, and the physio gives them to you. At the end of the first week, you know it's good for you, but you've given up because it's not very enjoyable. It's actually really boring. And what I kind of felt was physical activity is a means to an end. That's the key message. And the end is having time with your family, going out, exploring new places, perhaps learning a new skill, getting more confidence, being with your children, being with your parents. All of those things are the enjoyment, which is the outcome. But you have to, if you're clever, the physical activity has to be the bit that gets you there. So health might be the bit that kicks you off, but the sustainability has to be maintain enjoyment. And then, of course, it gets into the habit. And once you've got enjoyment and habit together, you've got to change your behaviour.
Yeah. The other aspect of some of the projects you do is that connection with nature as well. And because it always strikes me that there's something about being outdoors. I've just written a blog about it recently, because having been away on my holiday and getting back into the water, in some amazing water up in north of Scotland, is that whole reconnection back to nature again, and forgetting how much and how valuable that is. And that struck me about all your early projects had that environmental element to it. And every time I went to a conference on green exercise, I would meet you, because you were heading that whole thrust at the time.
And it was quite early on, because it still wasn't at all mainstream. I was really the nutty GP, where we had the green gym upstairs and the practice. So patients used to come into the waiting room to have their toenail done or something like that. And then these people came out with bow saws and axes, and they kind of said, hang on a sec, I don't think I'll get my toe done here. I think I'll go somewhere else. They felt this probably wasn't the practice that they thought it was. So to have green gym actually inside the practice was utter nuts at the time, and nature was a nice to have. People who intuitively felt, yeah, it's nice, but there was no evidence. It wasn't really solid at the time. And that's been incredible how over the years, I remember got commissioned to do the Oxford textbook of nature and public health, which we published about 2 years ago, and that was commissioned about 4 years before that, and that was even then really advanced in their thinking to do it. Now you can't get a single public health director who doesn't have it in their strategy. The Treasury have just put £10 million into green prescribing, wanting a cost-benefit model by the end, which DEFRA and DH are doing. It's absolutely mainstream. And I think climate change and COVID, I think, have both helped in putting people into that place. But I think also people are realising that the health model we've got doesn't work, and any other opportunity, particularly with the obesity and diabetes and mental health, we need new evidence. And the evidence, when I did that book with Matilda, we got evidence from pretty much every top university around the world. So they're all putting in the research now. It took 15 years, I think, for the NHS and others to catch up with the fact that the research was way before. And this is what's so crazy about the NHS. But they have all this evidence base, but because you have to have a systematic review, it means you must be at least 10 years past the point when the first research came out to do a systematic review. And then once the systematic review is done, if people don't like the answer, they can still change it to not how they want it.
Well, I read once when I was working at Loughborough, because I used to have this whole debate with the academics. It takes 17 years for something that's been researched to actually come to the development of a project or program, it can take up to 17 years before something's delivered.
That's shocking.
I know, it's scary, isn't it? It's really scary. And you think, and then this is the challenge, is we want things to be evidence-based, but we can't hang around sometimes waiting on the evidence. And I remember having a conversation with a leisure provider, we'll name this, who had said to me, I need you to speak to our public health advisor, because they are telling me there is no evidence for leisure services that anything we deliver actually helps people's health. And I'm like, well, I'm sure there is some out there. I mean, it might not be the intervention side of it. Yeah. And I remember having the conversation, and I went, can you tell me what else you would do? I said, if you had that money, how would you invest it? And they were so caught up of what they didn't know that you were thinking, yeah, but you've got to deliver something. You've got to make a decision on how you go about that. And we just, we were back and forth for a while.
That's that realist approach to research and evidence, isn't it? And I think we've mentioned this in one of the earlier episodes about that point of, because there is no evidence doesn't mean that it's not a good idea. It just means nobody's asked that question before.
Yeah.
So no evidence is evidence in itself.
I remember when we were talking about walking and cycling, and Living Street said, we don't need to do any more research because we know how it works. We know the evidence. And I said, well, yes, but if we keep on doing the same thing, we're getting nowhere. So you've got the evidence, but it's not landing. So we've got to work out how to land it better, because it's clearly not working because nobody's taking it up. And they couldn't get that. They said, but we've got the evidence. And I said, yes, but it's not working. In the end, there's evidence is hopeless if you can't change anything. It's the knowledge. It just becomes an academic curiosity. But unless it can change something, it's actually fairly useless. And the problem is for academics is that, well, we've done our job. And in many ways, sometimes they have. It's like guidelines. I remember Fiona Bull talking about this, that she said, what are good guidelines? Are they the academically perfect ones, which have got fully evidence-based, or are they the ones that change behaviour? Yeah. And she said, often, although everyone inherently feels it should be the latter, actually, majority of people in the academic world think it's the former.
So as we've started to kind of discuss here, evidence, gathering it, knowing what's out there already, creating your own, let's say, is obviously a fundamental part of creating a program that can get our community moving. William, big question on its way. What would you say are the big fundamental steps that have made the programs you've been involved with so successful in terms of their design and their creation? So evidence, is that the first step, or are there some things before that, or?
No, it is the first step, but it's a hybrid way. And people always say if Tesco had waited for systematic reviews on which products they should be selling, they'd be out of business in no time, because so how do they do it? And they do it by tiny lots of test and learns all the time. They're doing test and learn. They're putting the product on the shelves. They're watching how it goes. They're seeing whether if they change the packaging of it, or they put a new one, or they put it on a different shelf, or they promote it a different day. So they're constantly reiterating, and that's really the test and learn. And you have to do that as well as the evidence. If you rely on evidence on its own, it's stodgy, it's basic, it's not very granular at all. It's certainly not specific to the groups of people you're trying to reach. So I think you start off with the basis of evidence, but only use that as your foundation. To build the delivery, you then have to go into much more of the marketing knowledge, which has got its own science. It's not, I wouldn't like to even call it a science, it's common sense very often. You've got people with their own ideas, their own concerns, their own expectations, and what you're trying to do is to make something to feel that it belongs to them, it's right for them. So when we started on Beat the Street, which was mostly initially for children, in fact the very first one was in Hyde Park for the staff of Hyde Park, and then there were little wooden boxes, and then I got some plastic boxes and put mobile phones inside them, and I had to change the batteries every day for a year in Wimbledon, getting up at 5 o'clock every day with my colleague. We alternated it. God, I don't know how we quite did it. It's a 2.5 hour round journey. So that's when you're setting up a business. That's what you have to do. You have to be the person with the screwdriver and the accountant and this and that. So, but all of that way we learnt all the time, and you talk to people and you listen And sometimes you don't even say, how can we do this better? Because that's already leading them into what you're trying to do. You say, how can I sort out your problems? What are your problems at the moment? What's your daily problems? So you listen to all their daily problems, and then you make sure that what you're doing, first of all, is not exacerbating those problems, because that's first do no harm. But you're also then working out how what you're doing may not be able to sort out their leaking roof, etc., but it may sort out the fact that the husband comes home really late at night, and he's the breadwinner, and in the culture that we're growing, that the woman is not allowed out on her own with the children, because there has to be with the husband, and he's coming back very late. So how do we work out that? Well, we work it out by saying, right, let's get all of you women together with your children, and culturally that would be acceptable, and then create something very specific for you. I always remember the Birmingham, when they were trying to get secondary school children, that Karen Craven was doing, and the data showed from talking to those girls, teenage girls who wouldn't do it, that if they had hair straighteners in the loos, they'd be able to do the exercise. It's a famous one, and it's these little tiny things you're building up. The systematic review and evidence will never pick up any of those things before, but you listen, and you sort out the problems bit by bit, and by showing you're listening, you're also getting their trust, and therefore they're telling you a lot more, particularly when you sort that problem out. So I think that's how we've done it with Beat Street. We get vast amounts of data coming back. So we've reached 1.4 million. That's 800,000 children we have now reached, and we've got now up to 60% of them register giving their details, but 50% of all of those who've given us narratives about what they like and what they don't like. And that colour, which is additional to the figures about have they moved physical activity or not, that colour is what directs you and leads you to the next phase and next level.
There are two things that you've said there that have really, you speak about listening, kind of like my brain just went, love it, and I've held on to it until I get the opportunity. But the common sense element in relation to when you were kind of talking about that transference we go from the evidence kind of academic view of how we might build things into the way that we market them, in a sense. And in the design of a program, absolutely, my own experience and programs I've been involved with, it needs to fit. So there's the common sense approach to making it resonate and connect with me as a potential participant, but then it needs to feel like it is just part of everyday life. It's not this kind of intervention, let's say, that's shoehorned in, and it's like the elephant in the room, and it's not part of my daily routine. You mentioned the word habit before. That's a real key part that's in there. And the other that really stood out to me is that concept of listening and constantly making changes, not assuming that what you have solves a problem. And I think one thing that potentially, correct me if I'm wrong by commenting below this video, that people listening might have overlooked is the first thing that you said is check that the intervention or the program that you have isn't exacerbating their existing problems. Most of the time it's how does this fix your problem, or how does it, so it's that kind of I will fix or I will solve the world's ills with this. But it's, am I making it or am I not making it any worse? That's a really important thing to think about. It's got my brain going, certainly.
That example, I think there was plenty of examples that have come in of that, all well-meaning and innocent and trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
But the Conway Water part, was it the Green Route, which is in northeast Belfast, and the Conwater one, and they were trying to completely renovate the canal and the river that went there, and they had to straighten some parts of it, create marshland, create paths, create banks of grass and wildflowers and everything. Really beautiful, fantastic. And the team at Queen's University did the before and after, and it showed no change at all. In fact, it showed there was a drop in physical activity and people going there. And everyone scratched their heads after £9 million of EU funding had gone into that. And when they brought the community on board, they'd done everything right, absolutely everything right. But the one thing they probably hadn't done right is that they realised that loads more people came in from everywhere in the affluent parts of Belfast, because now it's such a beautiful area. So they suddenly felt, the community felt they were being pushed out. it wasn't theirs anymore. It was being gentrified, that dreadful word. So everything made sense, and it was done totally properly. Eventually, it did change because there was a lot more work. And that's the other thing. It takes time, and you should never have that kind of deadlines. And this is what really annoys me. Someone said to me, why didn't you do a randomized controlled trial of Beat the Street when you first started? Well, I thought it would fail. It would absolutely fail because we don't know what we're doing. We're starting out. And so many really good schemes have had to have evaluation plumped right at the beginning of the program when you haven't even finished the product. Doing the very first trains and the very first cars that were ever invented kept on blowing up and crashing and doing all sorts of things. So if we'd done an evidence-based program, we would have never had the car or the train. May not have been a bad thing not to have a car, but certainly you've got to wait for lots of things to have changed and for that product to have matured. And what they found in Belfast was the initial feeling was that everyone thought, oh, all these foreigners are coming in, other parts of people from Belfast. And the other thing they learnt is that, and we've learnt certainly, is that how totally small people's world are, that they won't even come out of the estate. They won't even go to the park 200 metres away because they don't feel it belongs to them. We had 60% of secondary school children in one school in Eastbourne had never been to the beach. And these are 15, 16-year-olds. So you have to, that's why when you say, well, why don't you go off and visit the South Downs or go on there? That's going a world away. It's never going to work. And unless you listen, you won't ever be able to sort that out. So I think that maturity of a program has to wait for the evaluation to fit. So you don't prematurely evaluate it and it goes wrong. And I think some brilliant schemes have gone by the wayside because of that. And then the second thing is, you do it iteratively, and you do it by testing, and you can still do test and learn, quite good little bits of evaluation along the way, which just do the job for that. It may not be ever published, but it will do good for what you're trying to do. So you try and get the balance, you make sure you're not being biased, you try and get the numbers big enough, you're trying to make sure the questions frame properly, you've got some clear outcomes. So you do all of the kind of discipline of evaluation, but in a microscopic scale, very quickly, and then with a very quick turnaround, without the worry that you're going to have this published and peer reviewed. Because I think the approach that Sport England have done, I have to say, fully congratulations. I mean, the report People and Places, which is the interim report of the evaluation of the LDPs, the local delivery pilots, is really fantastic. It's so refreshing. It says that we've done things wrong in the past. We've tried to put metrics onto things which don't need to be there because that's how it works in the funding system. So you've got outcomes and it all makes sense, but actually it doesn't make sense in the world that we live in. So the LDPs, they've stuck their neck out, they've put a lot of money into it, they've extended it. And I've been involved with the one in Essex, and it has really, the system change. We're now starting to see how that's impacting. And I keep on saying, don't get us wrong, we're not going to forget about the fact the end result has to be a change in physical activity. But at the moment, all we can measure is proxy markers. It's a bit like climate change and saying, we can't really measure the temperature now because the temperature is only changing microscopically, but we can tell all about the proxy markers of CO2 levels coming out, of methane, of different changes in climate, and all of these are the proxy markers of climate change. But the end point of how many degrees will come way later. Doesn't mean that we can't do anything. And the same with physical activity. We have to expect the changes of physical activity to take time and build slowly. And then they've got a proper foundation and totally embedded rather than a flash in the pan operation. And with the Beat the Street, our biggest thing is system change. We have the game as an incentive to get people going, but actually what we're doing is building relationships. And it's those relationships based on trust, based on knowledge, that will then be the foundation. So I think if people haven't read People and Places, have a quick download of it, because I think it is really good from Sport England to say this is the journey we're on, and it's very different to previous ways that we used to think.
What is it that we need to have in place to ensure that sustainability?
I think and I always feel that kind of you've got your 5 stages. I probably won't remember all 5 now, but the first thing is you've got to get the right people. So are we reaching the right people? With Walking for Health, there's always been that worry that we are reaching slightly more affluent areas. because it's much easier for the volunteer basis to be there. So it's always going to be slightly geared towards that. But then, are you actually engaging them? So are they turning up? Are you changing their behaviour? Are you sustaining that change of behaviour? And then can you scale it up? And once you've gone through those different phases, the bit between, once you've got the sustaining that behaviour, and that even if I think for a lot of the Walking for Health, it's people's, they didn't deteriorate. So they increased, but as their age went, they stayed the same, which is obviously a benefit compared to the tailing away of physical activity. So I think the sustainability of a place is simplicity. It has got to be number one. It's got to be really, really simple, and everyone gets it when you talk about it. In fact, sometimes the really good programs are so simple that nobody wants to fund them because they said it's common sense. So why do we need to fund it? But actually, as we all know, simplicity is years and years of hard work of cutting out the chaff and trying to keep it focused, etc. So sustainability works on simplicity. If you get it simple, it means you've done loads of work on it and you've got it right. So parkrun, another example, keeping it simple. They get the feedback, they've got the volunteer base. It's again, everyone gets it and it has its role, and that will hopefully stay. So I think from from the Walking for Health, it was that simplicity and it was able to be replicated and it worked, and people enjoyed it. It was not for everyone, and that's the other thing. You have to check that you are not being over ambitious in what you're doing, you keep to that cohort and get very good at that group of people, and then try and do everything. So that was the other way, keeping it simple, keeping that cohort, keeping the outcomes fairly simple, and making it and making also the fact that you don't need to keep pouring loads of money into it, because that's going to be the other problem. The final thing there, and the way to beat the street, I was worried obviously because it's a 6-week program really. There's 3 months preparation of getting all the people together, getting all the different groups, community groups and everyone else together. And then there's afterwards, you've got a whole year of keeping those relationships going. But what it does is that part in the middle, that game bit, is a catalyst with a time limited period, which means everyone has to make decisions and do something by a certain time. And that gets everyone galvanized. And that's what is very rarely, you get these steering groups set up and there's no kind of real deadline. So things just get kicked along. Here you've got this really focused, and then you've got thousands of people all playing every day choreographed, and suddenly people see a new world which they didn't realize existed, and it's on their doorstep and it's free, and they don't need to do anything. They don't need to buy anything. They don't need to they can now take their children to the park, which they've never been to before, and it's free. And they didn't do that before because they didn't know about it, and they didn't trust themselves, and they didn't have the confidence, and they didn't realize how enjoyable it would be for the child, because the child is so much happier in their bedroom playing games. But they suddenly realized that here was something that the whole family could do, but they needed that excuse to do it. So you're laying out a brand new world for them for 6 weeks with all the partners working together. So, but afterwards, the behavior change is in their mind. It's not lots of new health walk groups or lots of new groups. We get some of those, but it's the state of mind of every individual that's shifted. And that's where the behavior changes. So that's how you can keep sustainability of that, because we can go away. We don't want to be, we don't want dependent on us. We've done our bit. But what they've done now is that they've seen the world in a completely different place. It's opened their eyes, and that's where the behavior change will reside, not in external, how many people turned up to badminton sessions or how many people have done this or that's okay, but that's not the metric you're looking for. You're looking for those tiny little behavior changes of a mum taking her child to school, which they didn't do beforehand, walking rather than going by car. And they're the harder ones to measure. And it goes down to that whole problem of what counts can't often be counted. And it's that, I think, on the evaluation point of view, is something we have to really work out. If we just count the things that if we just count the things that can be counted, then we'll miss huge amount of change that's taken place, which stories and examples and all the qualitative work that has been going on has missed out. And that's where we've got to be really careful.
Yeah, I really love listening to that story and of how it's developed and how it operates, really, the Beat the Street model. And a lot of the work that we do at Move, we are a fan of the COM-B model for behaviour change. And in relation to what you've been talking about there, I was kind of ticking the boxes, almost going, right, okay, that bit's there, that bit's there. And absolutely the opportunity to be active as part of the structured intervention, but then beyond there, because it is so simple to engage with. And when we're designing and thinking about designing programs to get a community active, if it's a simple intervention to engage with, once the intervention potentially stops, they can replicate that behavior themselves and do it. And we know all of these additional benefits of being active, one being creativity. So if you've gained the confidence in walking around in your local community as a result of Beat the Street, you're feeling potentially more capable, you can see more opportunities, you're thinking more creative. It's going to lead to, I'm sure, and I don't know, William, whether you have any of these insights, but does Beat the Street, which is primarily a walking program, you could argue, does that lead to them engaging the families and young people in other activities other than walking?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, cycling is the other one that goes up hugely afterwards. So walking and cycling, but also because 1 week is dedicated to getting people more active in other sports and activities. So every day they've got huge opportunities to turn up to certain sports they've not done before, taster sessions, etc. So 1 week is about nature, 1 week is about active travel, 1 week is about sport. So each week is themed to make sure that people have got that opportunity. So the figures are, we've done, as I say, over for the Sport England first tranche, we got 430,000 people. Of that, we got about half filled up the questionnaires. So we got a good 230,000. And consistently, right across, 70% of those who were inactive became active and stayed active a year later. So that's really encouraging. And we overrepresented the deprived communities. Our biggest aim constantly is to get those people from those very deprived communities to get this. And because we bring it right to their doorstep, they don't have to even leave their estate to take part. And that's a real key thing. And I think the problems that we've got is, how do you get those people out when they've got so much of a crisis in their life, so chaotic, so difficult to manage every day? You've got to drop every barrier. And I remember, I think it was Dunstan who was set up Carphone Warehouse. They said, how do you make your Carphone Warehouse so successful? He said, every morning I wake up and I ask the team, what are the barriers between the customer and my phone? And every morning they'd have to think up another barrier. And he said, right, let's sort out that barrier. Let's sort out that one. And gradually. And I think that concept is really useful when you're trying to get people with a very different mindset, different lifestyle, different way of thinking. We've got no concept whatsoever of how they work or how people behave or what they're like. But that listening will create all these barriers. Right, let's start with that barrier, get rid of it. Let's start with that barrier. And you just keep on going. And one of the biggest ones we said is, which is why we still use these physical things rather than just a phone app. Everyone's got the ability to have a phone and ability to download an app, but we know the interaction between a fob and a beatbox outside is incredibly attractive for people to get it straight away without having to fiddle around with apps and things like that. And that's what our success, I think, has been. So we have got an app which we're developing, but this has really been the key. So that was one barrier that had to go down. Being really local was another one. Very simple. Getting your children to be the leaders was the other thing, to lead the parents, because the children were now saying to the parents, let's go for a walk, let's do that. That was really key. And then you just keep going. And that's where the sustainability stays.
There's some brilliant tips for just things and principles to consider in relation to both the design and the delivery of a program.
It's been a real pleasure, and as it could go on forever, but it would probably bore you to bits. But it's been really fantastic to talk to you both, and I've thanks for doing these sessions, because I think they've been really successful.
Thank you so much. If people are interested to learn more about the Beat the Street programme or the work that's going on at Intelligent Health, is the right place for them to go and have a little scratch around the Intelligent Health website?
Yeah, which is Intelligent Health or Beat the Street, intelligenthealth.co.uk and beatthestreet.me. You can see all the games in action at the moment. There are 11 games going on at the moment. Obviously, by the time you listen to this podcast, or you might actually be beyond that, but certainly you can go onto that. Both websites will be fine.
No, that's great, and thank you so much again for your time and being so generous with sharing your insights, William. As you may know, if you would like to learn more about other episodes in this series, you can see the links posted below this video or visit the Move Consulting website, moveconsulting.co.uk. And other than that, it's time to say goodbye. We will see you next month. Thanks again, William.
Thanks very much indeed. It's a real pleasure.